It's weighing in, NJ.com's high school wrestling podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Weighing In podcast on NJ.com, where we go up and down the state, covering New Jersey high school wrestling as in-depth as humanly possible. It's the state tournament. It's here. We've got the first two rounds in the books, and there's plenty to talk about as we recap a plethora of action from Monday night's quarterfinals and semifinal rounds of the public school tournaments. We'll look ahead to some of the matches upcoming, the sectional finals on Wednesday night for the public schools, and mix in some talk with the non-publics as we project what's going to happen, all on the road to Rutgers coming up on Sunday, where we will crown the 5 public school state champions, the 2 non-public state champions, and the first girls team state championship. So let's dive right into it. I'm Bob Batters, your host. I'll be joined, as always, by our NJ.com wrestling reporters, Bill Evans, Ryan Patti, and Jake Aferiat. So, guys, a big Monday, with everything going on around the state. And, I think we have to start in the South Jersey Group 5 section. It's not often you get a semifinal in the section like this, maybe ever, if we really went back and dug through the archives. 2 top 10 teams. I think the consensus is that Southern and Howell are the best teams in Group 5. 2 of the 3 highest ranked public school teams in the state. And it was a barn burner. Southern 33, Howell 26, the 3-time defending Group 5 champions move on to the sectional final. I was there. I was on the call for that one, and it was a great one from start to finish. Southern won the flip, which was huge. It enabled them to make some key maneuvers, chief of which was getting Levi Foote at 190, getting him away from Tanner Hodgins. They got him on Tim O'Rourke. Foote won 7-2. That was a big win. The freshman Anthony Molinaro had maybe the biggest win when you consider it was a toss-up at 150. He came through with a huge pin, and the Rams on their way to the championship match. Bill, I'll throw it to you because you have some knowledge of that South Jersey section as well, with Kingsway and Washington Township on the other side. And we've been talking about this. I think everyone can weigh in here. These are 2, powerhouse teams. Did they meet earlier than they should have? Yeah. But, talking to Southern head coach Dan Roy and even, Howell head coach John Gagliano, they both had a little bit of different opinions on it, but they both did agree that they were going to have to wrestle each other at some point, and then ended up being the sectional semifinals. And it was a dandy. I mean, take nothing away from, Kingsway, who Southern will face in the sectional final, but Bill, that certainly seemed like it was the state final right there.
Yeah, I mean, just based on the rankings and, the way that most people perceive them, I think people figured that Hal and Southern were the 2 best teams. And if had Hal been in Central, they probably would have met on Sunday. And even the fact that they're in the same bracket, I think most people thought they probably should have met on Wednesday. Like you said, though, Township and Kingsway are both very good teams. We'll get to that Township Kingsway match in a minute, but we'll find out on Wednesday, right? Because Kingsway's got a chance now to make their case and show that they deserve to be in the final. This is their 8th time in the last 9 years they made it to the final. Coach Mike Berkey noted even that a few of those years they weren't real competitive with Southern when they got there. I think he's expecting them to be competitive. Whether they win or not, we'll see. But I think this will be really a stepping stone for them because they are a very young team. And I think that even if they don't beat Southern this year, I think if they go out there and they can compete, I think next year they're going to go get to that final again and, probably feel like they have a pretty good chance to win it if they don't this time around.
And on the match last night, Southern Howell, 2 longtime short conference rivals and powers. A short conference team has won the South Jersey Group 5 section every year since its inception in 2015. And Southern's going to try to do that again on Wednesday night. Both teams are really good freshman classes. And a couple of the freshmen for Southern really came through in a big spot. First was Anthony Molinaro, not related to Southern legend Frank Molinaro, but he came through clutch like Frank the Tank did so many times. Howell was up 3-0, got a key decision in double overtime. Shane McGann with a ride out of Dion Masenko. So Howell with an early, boost in a toss-up bout, but Southern came back. Their sophomore Henry Zimmerman, who had a key win in the victory over Delsea, he had a 5-1 decision at 138. Attila Vigilante came through to pin at 144. Not unexpected there, one of Southern's hammers. And then the pin by Molinaro at 150, locked in the cradle, and that put Southern up 15-3. And that was really the story for Southern, and really what the Rams have done so well throughout their championship history. They win these toss-up bouts. They find ways to win. They get the late takedown to make it a major. They get the late takedown or points to prevent bonus points. They find the pin. They hold the bonus points. And those little things add up throughout a match and throughout a tournament. And that's why Southern is the 3-time defending Group 5 champs, and why they're the favorite to do it again. So just a big performance by Southern. The toss was huge. Both teams knew that, and it came up in Southern's favor, which enabled them, to make the moves necessary and really avoid some of Howell's, immense bonus point capability up top. If Southern doesn't win that, they're able to get, Howell's able to get Tanner Hodgins on Levi Foote. Maybe the match is significantly different. Certainly that you're talking about what could be potentially a 9-point swing there, which obviously would put the match in Howell's favor. But, the Rebels just continue to impress and find ways to win and do it on the biggest stage. And, and then now they'll move ahead to Kingsway on Wednesday night. We're going to try to lock up another sectional title, going for their 9th in a row. So that was a really good one. It's a shame that we didn't get that with a championship on the line. One good point Dan Roy made, the Southern head coach, was that the atmosphere is probably better at Howell than it would have been for Rutgers for that. Now, certainly Rutgers can hold more fans, but, we did have it in a small gym, the spotlight on, it was packed. And, I think the fans were treated to a really good one. And their opponent, as we mentioned, will be Kingsway. The rematch, went in favor of the Dragons. Bill, you were there, and a surprise new face for Kingsway that helped the Dragons pick up the win, and certainly bodes well for the present and the future.
Yeah, Cole DeNick, who was a state qualifier district champ as a freshman. Wrestling is his third sport. He's a Rutgers commit for lacrosse. He's an all-state football player. He's said as a freshman, he really doesn't even like wrestling all that much. Last year, he did not come out for the team. Kingsway was in a little bit of a rebuilding period, very brief rebuilding period as it turned out, didn't come out. There was a big debate at the beginning of the year whether he was going to come back out this year. I think he might have been leaning in that direction, and then all of a sudden he tore ligaments in his ankle in the sectional final in football and was not even cleared to compete until 2 weeks ago. At which point, did it make sense to bring him out? If had this happened a year ago, there would have been no way he would have come out. But, Kingsway's had a great year. They were going to face, as it turned out, Washington Township, their biggest rival. This is the 7th time they've met in the last 4 years. Washington Township has won all 4 regular season meetings. Kingsway has won all 3 postseason meetings. And Mike Brickian posed it to him. Do you want to come out? You think you could really help us, even if it's for a match or two? He said, sure. And, he came out yesterday and pinned 2 kids in under a minute after having not wrestled for 2 years. Brickian has called him the best athlete that he's seen in Kingsway in the 10 years he's been there. I can't really argue with that. I mean, you can just see what he does in every sport. And we'll see if he makes a difference against against Southern. And also we'll see if he decides to compete in the individual postseason, because, he's a kid that could really go far if he chooses to, even though he hasn't stepped on a mat in 2 years. But beyond Cole DeNick coming back, it was a great match, as many of them are. It started strong. Jamar Greaves ended up in a close match, got late bonus points taken as his opponent Landon Stone to his back in the final seconds to push it to a major. Chris Owen got a reversal in the next match with 3 seconds left to win that one 6-4. Then DeNick gets the pin. The teams traded dramatic pins, third period pins at 106 and 113. Washington Township got a pin from a freshman, the decision from a freshman, Brandon Lucia, at 126, wrestling only his second match of the year. He was mostly been a JV kid behind those studs down low, but they bumped the line up, and it got late. Kingsway seemed to have it in control, and then Jacob Gledel throws Ryan Glenn to his back down 14 points, which he's done before. Was at the Township Delsea match earlier this year. He was down 14-0 and pinned Jamison Devlin from Delsea, and he might have been stuck. It was real close, but they didn't make the call. Kingsway ends up pinning on the last two weights. Gabe Eisenhart, who's a junior that's kind of been a program kid, gets the pin in the last match, and Kingsway's off to the final. I said brighter things ahead. They're a very young team. I think this was a big step for that program, and now they're hosting Southern, and I think that's going to be a big deal for them. And I think they can compete, and we'll find out on Wednesday.
Then up in North Jersey, there was a lot going on. We had a 7 seed knocking off a number 2 seed in the quarterfinals. We had a team reaching its first ever sectional final. We had a traditional Group 1 powerhouse going down. We had an unexpected blowout in one of the sections. We had a top seed losing on criteria. As Ryan put it, chaos in North Jersey. So Ryan and Jake, we'll let you guys take it away. Ryan, you were at a couple matches on Monday, and a lot else was going on in those North 1 and North 2 sections.
Yeah, you mentioned the 7 over the 2. That was Passaic beating North Bergen. And I mentioned last week that the upsets up north, they kind of just happen. You can't really pinpoint them. And this was one of those matches that was not on my bingo card. And Passaic is very well coached. Brian Smith, Mark Polaro, those guys do a great job there. But like I said, this was unexpected. North Bergen came in at 17-5. Granted, they were missing a couple kids. They weren't at 100%, but I figured that, hey, they're going to get to wrestle PCTI in the final. But that's not how things work when the team tournament comes around. Crazy things happen. And then you had Pompton Lakes over Kittatinny. And I know it's a 2 beating a 3, but coming in, you guys know I hyped up Kittatinny a lot. I know they were 500 coming in, but that's a very good 3 seed. That's a team that I thought was going to win the section. You look at that strength of schedule, win over Ridge, a lot of close losses to really good teams. And like I said, I thought they were the team to beat in the section, and they had made the sectional final 7 straight years coming in. I believe it was actually the first time in 8 years they hadn't made a sectional final this year. But, Pompton Lakes comes through clutch. They got Christian Murcia back. He was out for 2 weeks, but they got him back at 57, and it really rounds out their lineup, and they got it done. Now they get Emerson Park Ridge for the 3rd time this year, and Emerson's won both those matches in a pretty convincing fashion. We'll see what happens this time. But lastly, the match that I covered, the second of 2 matches I covered, Riverdell hosted Paramus. Riverdell 21-1 coming into the match. The only match they lost coming in was to Paramus in the Passaic Bergen duels semifinals over a month ago. And Riverdell makes an 18-point comeback. They were down 30-12 with 4 to go. And they won by a point. And Cole Ranley, the 106-pounder, the match started at 113. He gets a major where, he's losing in the first period, gets a reversal in the second period, and then goes on a tear in the third period, a 7-point move to pick up the major. Had to ride him out the last 30 seconds or so. But an amazing match, an amazing cap to a wild day in North 1. And Jake, I know you had your eye on a lot of North 2 matches. One came down to criteria. Really just a lot of chaos, like Bob said, all over North 1 and North 2.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and Bob alluded to it a little bit, North 2 Group 4, I think one of the semifinals, in addition to Howell Southern, that we were most looking forward to, was North Hunterdon against Middletown North, which was a rematch of last year's section final in that section that North Hunterdon won 32-31, thanks to some late heroics, some good coaching maneuvers. And, as I was watching that stream on Monday, the thing that was apparent to me was, okay, it started at 190. And, I think Coach Bell has admitted as much that, listen, they have some questions in the upper weights. And, at times things there haven't, gone their way when they expected they might. That was not the case on Monday. They started at 190, got bonus points almost immediately. They were helped by the fact that Dan Benbrook didn't wrestle at 190, which I think myself and some other people thought he might, or they might see him at 175. But so that was a big way to start things out. And Dylan McGinnis got a tech fall in 3:18, and basically those 3 minutes and 18 seconds portended what was to come for North Hunterdon. The Lions won 10 bouts, other than at 150. 9 of those bouts were bonus point wins, which is a pretty incredible bonus rate. And again, it wasn't just the guys in North Hunterdon that you're familiar with, whether it's Reed Busby, Caden Wadle, who we'll get to, Aiden Yarusi, Kieran Rayleigh. It was again, some of the guys in the middle and up top who maybe don't always get to play, but were super integral to this performance. And in Kieran in Wadle, he took on Thomas Blewett in a matchup of 1 versus 2 in the state at Middletown North. And I mean, Blewett asserted control early, took him down early, and kind of never let up. Was tough on top, and Blewett walked out of there with a 10-2 major. Sort of firmly cemented, at least for now, his spot as the state's best 106-pounder. We'll see if that follows him into districts, into regions, whatever it might be. But yeah, so that, even though Mid-North, I think, lost on the day, if you're Coach Eric Morley, you've got to look at that result, certainly, and be encouraged that, they have a kid who's, a legitimate as legitimate a state title contender as anybody. And, at 113, Ryan Blewett, who's state ranked for us also, he picked up a win. He pinned in 55 seconds over Peyton Hofstetter. So yeah, those 2 wins, Middletown North cut the gap to 17-10, but then from there, North Hunterdon won 6 bouts in a row and kind of put it out of reach. So, that I think was one that surprised us. The other one that was sort of surprising to me was, North 2 Group 3 with Cranford and Morris Hills. And, Cranford's a team, perennial power. Pat Gorman always does a great job out there. Obviously they've had Jordan Chapman in the past. Now they've got Michael Daly and Luke Schultz and their share of hammers. But they actually lost on criteria yesterday as the top seed in North 2 Group 3. The criteria they lost on was criteria F, fewest forfeits. They forfeited 2 weights. I think it was 106 and 190, I believe. 106 and 190. And those 2 forfeits did the Cougars in. That allowed Morris Hills to advance. And I was doing some research beforehand. So Cranford losing as the top seed, Howell losing as the top seed, and then Central Regional losing as the top seed. So, this is only the 8th time, I think, or 7th time in the last 5 years that a number 1 seed hasn't advanced to a section final. So I think that just goes to show sometimes how maybe top heavy, this sport can be, and how, lopsided some of these sections are. So, I think when we get these upsets, it's, it's important to highlight them. And then, in North 2 Group 2, Caldwell, it really impressed me. They beat a very good Hackettstown team. That match started at 132, or 138, excuse me, which was a decent weight for Caldwell to start at. But, they quickly got a wake-up call when Rocco Conforti got pinned 32 seconds in after leading big. But then at 175, Ivan Paradello, who sophomore, second-year wrestler, sub 500 on the year, he came back. He was down 10-1, battled his way back to make it 11-11, and he got a pin. And, that's a weight and an area of Caldwell's lineup where there had been some questions. So, Carmine Sipper clinched things at 120 with an 8-1 decision over Joey Rowinski from Hackettstown, and what was a great bout. But, if you're, and I was talking to Coach Sean Romano after, he's encouraged that, now they're starting to look more like a complete team and not just a team that's going to beat you down low. And they'll travel to Chester to wrestle West Morris on Wednesday. And I was looking, they're looking to become the first Essex County school ever to win 3 straight section titles. West Essex has won 2 in a row 3 times. Cedar Grove's won 2 in a row. Caldwell's won 2 in a row, but no team has ever won 3. So those are kind of some of the ones in North 2 that caught my eye.
And Jake, you mentioned the top seeds going down, and you mentioned Central Regional in South Jersey Group 4. The team that dealt them the loss was a Northern Burlington team that came with a 14-12 record, had some questionable losses on its schedule, but none of that mattered because the Greyhounds are moving on to the championship match in South Jersey Group 4. And that's the great thing about the state tournament. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. Some of these sections, when the PowerPoints were finalized and we took a look at them, they were wide open, and we had an idea of who we thought could come through. And, that has played out in some cases, and in others, it absolutely has not. And it's been all over the place. So, for Northern Burlington, Joe Zadalis, wrote the story on that last night. And, Northern Burlington's head coach, Wayne Stinson, told his team, listen, whatever your record was, that was last season. The state tournament is a new season. And they certainly took that to heart, coming away to 48-29 victory over the Golden Eagles. They move on to the championship match where they'll face Toms of Reist. And Bill, Northern Burlington, not a team that anyone thought was going to be in a sectional final yet. Here they are. Wednesday night, they'll try to go for the title.
Yeah, no, and we did say that this section was, pretty much a crapshoot, right? I mean, we knew that kind of going in. That I don't want to say any team could win it, but we knew that there was a lot of more competitive matches. There wasn't an overwhelming favorite, and so it was still a mild surprise, as you mentioned. That they had lost 3 in a row in early February. One of those losses was to Pennsauken, who's 9-13. That was a big surprise. But as Coach Stinson mentioned, that they've gone through a lot of different scenarios this year with kids being out of the lineup for one reason or the other, and now they're kind of at their best. They came out that they wrestled a solid Williamstown team, beat them pretty handily, and then they go into the Central match. Central almost lost in the first round of Cherry Hill West. They were down 6 going in the last 2 weights, needed wins and bonus on the last 2 weights to win that match. And then, they get to the final and Northern Burlington, they come out, they win 5 of the first 6, 4 of those by pin, build up a 27-6 lead. Central cuts back into it, makes it 27-13. Then Logan Burke, big 7-4 decision at 190. Cody Phillips follows with a pin, and that put them up 13 with 3 to go. And they end up winning at 48-29. The other side of that bracket was really competitive too. At least in the early going, Toms River East Clearview was a 1-point match where Toms River East did forfeit the final match, but it was a 7-point match with 1 to go. Very competitive. And then, Toms River South on the other side squeaked by a couple points. And then East defeated South pretty handily. But the early round matches showed that, anybody could have come through that section and at least gotten to the semifinal round. Northern Burlington, we'll see. I think Toms River East now has a pretty good chance. Will be favored to win their first title. But Northern Burlington showed the other day that last night that the section's wide open, and it's the team that's wrestling the best at this time of year, and they wrestle pretty well on Monday night.
And quickly on Toms River East, that was certainly a revenge match for the Raiders. They lost to Toms River South in last season's South Jersey Group 4 final, 40-28, and they blew the Indians out of the water. 54-17 was the final. They won 10 bouts, and now the Raiders go into that championship match, which they will host. Like you said, Bill, feeling pretty good about their chances. And there's a chance way some of these sectional finals end up, Toms River East could have a path to get to the Group 4 final, which would be pretty incredible, again, as you said, for a team looking for its first championship. So another section I want to quickly touch on, Central Jersey Group 3, another one of those wide open ones where, really had no idea. It could have gone, a million different ways. The top seed is Brick Memorial. They are the defending champion, but there was tons of question marks around the Mustangs. This is a team with a new head coach and Steven Janos, who was the head coach at Toms River East last year when they made it to the sectional final. He's the nephew of Brick Memorial, legendary head coach Tony Caravella. But Brick Memorial really behind the 8 ball to start the season. They graduated some key wrestlers, notably 3-time state champion Harvey Luddington, who's now a freshman at Iowa. They lost a state medalist to transfer in Sonny DiMatteo going to CBA. They lost another one, a district medalist in Kassan Young transferring to Neptune. 3-time state qualifier Trey Talmadge, an all-state football player, decided not to come out to wrestle. So all of a sudden you're looking at a lineup that's really relying on, one or two holdovers and some freshmen. And here's Brick Memorial in the sectional final again. They beat Hopewell Valley 33-26 in a matchup that I think a lot of us figured could be, could have been considered the sectional final. It just so happened Hopewell Valley was the 4 seed, and now Brick Memorial, they'll try to extend their shore conference record and win their 20th sectional title on Wednesday night when they take on Robbinsville. So that was an intriguing one there. Nothing really stunning coming out of there, but just want to point out Brick Memorial, a team that I think we all wrote off a little bit early in the season just because of everything that transpired with the wrestlers they lost. Listen, Central Jersey Group 3, not the deepest section, wide open pretty much, but Brick Memorial trying to go for another title Wednesday night. Now we'll look ahead to those finals on Wednesday night. And we've touched on, several of these already, but, we'll do it again here a little bit more in depth. And we'll go back to South Jersey Group 5, Southern, Kingsway, a big time matchup. These teams have met multiple times in the sectional tournament. And I remember this is probably going back. I think Southern Kingsway had a pretty stunning win over Southern, probably in the 2012, 13, somewhere around that time. Kingsway's wrestling great, and these are two young teams. Obviously, Southern has the pedigree winning these last 3 championships. Kingsway seems like they get better and better every single match they go out. Cole DeNick gives them a massive boost, especially in an area where Southern is already not that strong compared to the lower and middle portions of its lineup. Maybe that's an area Kingsway exploits. There's a path here for the Dragons. I think probably everything would have to go their way. They'd have to win all the toss-ups, win the flip, maybe get something unexpected, but maybe this match is closer than a lot of people expect, Bill.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Cole DeNick being back up top, they have he weighed in at 215, even though he wrestled both matches at heavyweight. Chris Owen, their other upper weight, is pretty solid. So if they can get bonus points on his upper 2 weights, then down low, they've got 4 freshmen. A few of them pretty good. I think a few of those guys are going to end up being state qualifiers, but that's obviously where Southern's real strong too. Can they pick off one of those matches too? Can they get some wins in the middle weights? Another freshman, Matthew Miranda there, Ryan Preziosi at 138. Can they get a good matchup for him? I know Vigilante is down for Southern, so it could come down to a toss. Ryan Glenn. They have some decent kids in the middle weights. They're going to have to look for some good matchups. They're going to need to get bonus up top. They're going to need to pick off probably one of those bottom 4, save bonus points where they can. And we'll see. They're definitely the underdog. But I think, it should be a competitive match, especially if Kingsway can get some of the matchups they like.
And listen, no team is perfect. Every team has, stronger and weaker spots in its lineup, but Southern now, and as head coach Dan Roy pointed out on Monday night, the first time all season Southern's had as its optimal lineup in place. And you go those first 4 weights, Jonas Lusker at 106, Nick Banos at 113, the 2 standout freshmen, state medalist Cade Collins at 120, 2-time state medalist and 1-time finalist Anthony Mason at 126. Man, most teams just do not match up down there. We saw that against Howell. It made the turn. It was tied, and there was just a huge, advantage in 3 of those 4 weights for Southern, and just the depth is there. Dion Masenko at 132, Henry Zimmerman, or Attila Vigilante at 138. They've been able to flip-flop those guys, and that just gives Southern an advantage. And we saw it against Howell, and I think we'll see it the rest of the way. Southern does such a good job of planning this out and getting guys at weights where you have multiple options. Even if they lose the toss, they have backup plans. And, as I said before, they just find a way to win. So Kingsway is wrestling great. Listen, Southern's the champ for a reason. I think it's going to take a Herculean effort to knock off the Rams on Wednesday night. We'll have that live on NJ.com. Myself and our cameraman producer, Josh Noble, will be down in Woolwich, bring you all the action. Start time 6:30. So we look forward to that. North 1, we've got some sections definitely that we're looking at up there. Ryan, we touched on some of those. What stands out to you? What are you most anticipating, Wednesday night? Which box scores are you going to be checking other than the match that you'll be at?
Yeah, Bob. So I think it's going to be North 2, North 1, Group 2, North 1, Group 3, North 1, Group 4. Those are the ones I'm keeping an eye on. And I think, besides obviously Mount Olive, Peaburg, and North 1-4, which we'll touch on in a second here, I think High Point, Passaic Valley is going to be incredible. High Point's been in 16 straight sectional finals, and they have 31 titles. Passaic Valley's won one sectional title. That was back in 2018. But I actually think they come into this one as a very slight favorite based on just full body of work. They put some pressure on Howell. They competed with Bosco. They beat Ocean, who High Point lost to. But on the flip side, you had High Point beat West Morris, who PV lost to. Both schools wrestled West Essex pretty tough. And High Point also wrestled Washington Township very tough, and they were ranked for us only a couple weeks ago. So there's some interesting things here. Like I said, PV I think is a favorite, but if you look at some other scores, they might not be. It's really a match that could go either way. So we'll see what happens there. But Ramapo, River Dell, two of the better public school teams in North Jersey this season. They're going to meet in North 1 Group 3. I would lean Ramapo, but Riverdale's 22-1. They avenged that lone loss to Paramus in the semis yesterday, but Ramapo is 20-3. They've wrestled a really tough schedule against a lot of good teams. One of their losses is to Passaic Valley, Mid-North as well. So they've lost to a couple really good Group 2 schools. But, Coach Baronello, I know he's fired up for Riverdale. Bill DeMoro is fired up for Ramapo. Two alumni of the respective schools they coach. Ramapo's looking for their first sectional title ever. This was their first sectional title berth the other day. So, Ramapo's making some history this year. Riverdale's got its best team in a few years. So, Riverdale's been really clutch down the stretch of matches. They make huge comebacks. They win close matches. I think they've won 5 or 6 single-digit matches. But then you had Ramapo the other day. They brought all their middleweights down to weight. So they've stretched their lineup out a little more. That matchup's going to be interesting. I would lean Ramapo, but Riverdale, they have some moxie, so that could go either way. But finally get to Mount Olive and Peaburg here. It's a rematch of last year's sectional final that went in favor of Peaburg. This is the first time this year I'm going to see Mount Olive in full in person, and I'm kind of glad I waited because they're finally completely healthy now. Cole Rebels, he's been back for a couple weeks. Shane Kostakos came back the other day for them, and they really haven't had their full lineup like all season until now. They wrestled Southern very tough without Cole Rebels. Granted, Southern didn't have Jonas Lusker in that match, but I think it was a 38-26. So, they're right there with Southern. Mount Olive is built like a non-pub. They're built like a Southern where they have a ton of state qualifiers. I think the only difference between those teams is that, Southern and the non-pubs, they're getting kids to the podium, while Mount Olive's kind of just getting kids into the tournament. I think they're going to have a couple kids at the podium, but we could talk about that in a couple weeks. I think, this is Mount Olive's to lose, right? They've been knocking at the door for a while. Their signature team, the 2021 team, they won the matches like this, and I think this team is built pretty similarly. We'll see what happens. Peaburg, they've wrestled the schedule. They have that tradition where, a tight match, they find a way to win it. But ultimately, I think Emerson should win North 1 Group 1. I think Passaic Tech should win North 1 Group 5. But, Groups 2, 3, and 4, I think you're going to get some epic matches. And I know one that we're looking at, obviously, is Mount Olive Peaburg. So, Jake, you've had your eyes on Peaburg, a lot over the course of this year. Like I said, a rematch from last year's match that Peaburg dug out. They won the toss-ups. They got bonus. I think they got bonus in 5 of their 7 bout wins. So do you kind of have to see it going the same way? How do you see this match going?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing is, when we look at last year, Peaburg beat Mount Olive by 2 in the regular season, beat them by 2 in the postseason. And they were supposed to meet in the regular season this year back in December, but that was when Phillipsburg had to shut down its program for like 10 days because of a skin issue. So, I'll be curious to see, because again, obviously Mount Olive was banged up early. Was that Phillipsburg's best shot at Mount Olive? Was, beating them back in December? I really don't know. But, I think, listen, I picked Phillipsburg, when we did our previews. And, I think I still give them a slight edge, only insofar as, the thing for me that I always look for is margin of victory. And while Phillipsburg doesn't blow a lot of teams out, that to me is almost an encouraging sign, only because that means, okay, when the going gets tough late, you've got guys who are able to, dig deep, go the full 6 minutes, gut out wins. And, when you're used to blowing teams out, maybe that changes your calculus, changes your approach a little bit here and there. And so, again, the fact that they beat Immaculata by 4, Bosco by 5, Rumson by 1, North Hunterdon by 5, Old Bridge by 7. There are a lot of results in there that make me say, okay, you know what, if this is a tight match, coming down the stretch, coming into, the final couple bouts, that bodes well for Phillipsburg because they've been in that spot before. Whereas, if we look at Mount Olive, their closest margin of victory is probably, their 21-point win against Cranford. Now, few teams in the state are wrestling better than Mount Olive right now. They started 0-2. They've won 16 in a row since. So, they're going to be a hard team to stop. And, I think where Mount Olive is really good, obviously at 215, 285, 120. I think the key there, like you said, is limiting bonus and, maybe some kids springing an upset. But, listen, for as good as Mount Olive's top guys are, Phillipsburg has guys like Owen Garrett's, Gavin Galetta, Anthony Pettinelli, Zach Swingle, who, can make noise and do some damage when they need to. So, I think this is going to definitely be, as much as it's going to be a wrestling match, I think it's going to be a chess match too, in terms of, how do they handle Cole Rebels? Do they bump somebody away from him? Or, do they say, hey, we need to limit bonus there and we'll bump Matt Velez or whomever it might be, up at 32 or 38. So, I think they have that flexibility. I think I wrote last week, they haven't been afraid to move their lineup around. I think a bunch of their guys have spent an equal amount of time at 2 or 3 different weights. And that's a good luxury to have, especially, in the team state tournament, especially I think for a Phillipsburg team that made a state final last year, lost by 10 to North Hunterdon after losing by 10 to them in the regular season. I think the Liners, if they can, this will, I think, be their toughest test to date so far, other than Southern. And I think if they can get past this, it's hard not to like their chances in a state semifinal against potentially either Cold Sneck, Toms River, or maybe even North Hunterdon again. So, I think if Phillipsburg wins, it wouldn't shock me. If Mount Olive wins, it wouldn't shock me. But I think both teams need a lot to go their way.
There are 2 remaining undefeated public schools in New Jersey, and they've been on a collision course since pretty early in the season. And here we go. Wednesday night, the O must go. Top seeded Delaware Valley, number 2 seed Manville in Frenchtown. The 13th ranked Terriers will host that sectional final, and those 2 teams rolled into the championship. Delaware Valley outscored its 2 opponents 154-5 in the quarterfinals and semifinals. And Manville just a tad behind that, wins of 68-4 and 54-19 to get to the sectional final. This is a big one. Obviously, 2 undefeated teams meeting. Manville 29-0, Del Val 21-0. Delaware Valley with, a big tradition edge in terms of titles. They're defending Group 1 champ, 23 sectional titles in total. Manville 4 sectional titles to its credit, but the last coming all the way back in 1994. 2 great head coaches and 2 all around good guys in Del Val's Andy Fitz and Manville's Pat Gorbatuk. Del Val's the favorite. What do you see in this one, Jake? Again, a matchup I know that in Group 1 in this section, this is the one we've been waiting for since early on.
Yeah, so listen, like I talked to Pat Gorbatuk when Manville was off to like an 8-0, 9-0 start, and he said like he knows the team that they're chasing is Del Val, and he doesn't make any bones about it. But he also knows, like, listen, this is a team that took, I think it was 3rd place at the Somerset County tournament, and that's in a county tournament that has a non-public school in Immaculata, a Group 4 school in Ridge, a Group 5 school in Bridgewater Raritan, Group 5 school in Hillsborough, you know, a bunch of other bigger schools. And so they've shown they can hold their own. And again, you know, we talk about margin of victory. You know, there was a time where, you know, Manville was basically scoring 50 plus points every dual meet. And, you know, some of that, sure, you can talk about level of competition. You know, Manville, I think, has 11 or 12 wins over teams that made the state tournament. You know, like, you know, and again, for a team like them, you know, they beat Warren Hills, who's a, you know, a perennial Skyland and state power. You know, they beat Bernards, and, you know, they beat Kittatinny by, you know, 33 points. You know, they beat a very good Union team that's now in a section final. You know, they beat Franklin and Governor Livingston that, you know, won a playoff match. South Plainfield, you know, that was their closest match actually of the year, 35-33. So yeah, you know, and listen, you know, this is a young team. You know, I think Pat Gorbatuk told me they only graduate 2 kids who were, you know, real contributors from last year. And I mean, you know, they've got already, you know, 3 kids with 30 plus wins, you know, which is pretty incredible, plus another 4 with 25 plus, or 5, excuse me, with 25 plus wins. So everywhere you look, you know, there are kids in this lineup that are capable of doing damage. Now, Delaware Valley's, you know, seemingly been a different animal altogether. You know, they just seemingly somehow always find a way to win. The one thing I will say, you know, this Del Val team, obviously, listen, they're great. And, you know, you don't beat North Hunterdon and Phillipsburg and Ridge and Cranford by accident. But, you know, they maybe don't have the firepower that they have had in the past. And I think I said that on an earlier episode. You know, they don't have a kid like Jaden Perez, who's, you know, a multi-time state medalist and is now wrestling at Drexel. You know, they don't have some of these other, you know, big time names. But, you know, I think that almost, again, makes them more dangerous because, you know, they've got guys who you might not expect and who, you know, I know Pat Gorbatuk and company aren't overlooking anybody or aren't taking anybody lightly, but just the fact that you could see some, you know, less heralded guys or some unknown guys step up for both teams, I think makes it interesting. I mean, listen, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I think Manville, you know, last year these two teams met, you know, in the section final, Del Val won 65-9, you know, even with all that Manville has coming back, you know, can they overcome a 56 point margin of victory or 56 point deficit? I don't know, but I think they certainly can close the gap and make it maybe more competitive than a lot of us think it'll be.
And sticking in Central Jersey Group 2, an intriguing section. And we've talked a lot about some of the seeds and how they, you know, don't really make sense in terms of, you know, where the team should be. You know, Howell Southern was at the top of that list. Delsea as well as the number 3 seed in South Jersey Group 3, although that's really not going to have a factor on anything. And another one was in Central Jersey Group 2 with Rumson-Fair Haven, the 2-time defending Group 2 champs, as the number 6 seed. That kind of messed it up more for the teams that Rumson had to wrestle, you know, kind of seeing them earlier than they would anticipate. Listen, you get the number 2 seed, you probably expect you're not going to have to face the reigning state champion until the sectional final. That didn't happen for Ocean and Wall. Rumson with a 41-30 win over Ocean, then a 40-32 win over Wall. Those matches a little bit closer than the scoreboard to indicate, a couple forfeits at the end of those. Then on the other side of the bracket, you had Point Boro staying red hot. Point Pleasant Boro 47-27 over Homedale, then 50-25 over Del Rand. So Point Boro's wrestling its best that it has all season, and it's going to need a lot, if not everything, to go its way if it's going to knock off Rumson and win its first sectional title since 2018. You know, with Rumson, and I wrote this, you know, in the previews, and we've talked about it as well. There's some holes in Rumson's lineup, but where they're good, they're very good. And you either have to beat one of their 5 hammers and hope you have the matchups and the wrestlers to do that, or you have to pretty much win every toss-up bout and get bonus where you need to. So, you know, the Panthers, they're wrestling, you know, great right now. Can they wrestle well enough to beat Rumson? You know, we'll find out on Wednesday night. It's, you know, Rumson entered as the favorite despite being the number 6 seed, and, you know, we'll see that one shakes out. But I think that's a sneaky, interesting matchup to watch. And then finally, we'll throw it to South Jersey again. Paulsboro is not the dominant force that it's been throughout its history, but the Red Raiders just keep finding a way. And I think that speaks more about what they are as a program when they're not at their best and people are doubting them. And, hey, is this the year they don't win it? And, what's going on? And here they are again, just making statements in the sectional tournament and one win away from another sectional championship, Bill.
Yeah, they've won 44 out of 45. The lone time they didn't win was in 2009. They lost to Collingswood in a match that came down to the last minute of the last match. And really, when you look at 45 years, I mean, there might only be 5 where you thought that another team might have a chance to beat them. I'm pretty old. I'm not old enough to remember the 80s. But I've seen was on those teams, and I've seen the records that year. I think they've lost more matches this year than they lost in the entire decade of the 80s. So I don't imagine they were challenged too much back then. But yeah, I mean, they came out the other night against Shalleck and won 52-20, which was, I guess, not totally surprising that it was that lopsided, but to a point that Paulsboro hasn't blown out too many teams this year, and Shalleck did match up okay in some spots. Audubon, they're going to face Audubon. Audubon was a little bit on the ropes against Woodstown. They were down 30-14 at one point. Obviously, a lot of that's where you are in the lineup, where you're strong, where you're weak. But still, you're down 16 points in the second half of the match, and you have some work to do, and the other team can kind of go about trying to stay off their backs. Audubon did kind of come back and win that match. They got up 41-30 with a weight to go. So it's going to be interesting. They wrestled earlier this year. It was 37-33 Paulsboro, which at the time was a little bit of an upset. Paulsboro was struggling a bit. Audubon, looked a little stronger. Paulsboro got some pins down low, which, Audubon gave up 3 straight pins to Woodstown in the lower weights again the other night. So, Paulsboro's going to have to, get their bonus points down low where they're kind of strong. Audubon's Mason Konopka was at 113 the last time they wrestled. Now he's at 106. That could change some matchups. Paulsboro's best wrestler, Will Cruz, is a 106, but he's been wrestling up at 113 because they plugged in another wrestler at 106 and kind of lengthened their lineup a little bit. We'll see what the matchups end up there. Paulsboro ended up winning that on the upper weights. They bumped Frank Daminger from 190 to 215, where he clinched the match. A move they're probably going to have to make again. And this is going to come down to bonus points, I think. Last again 37-33 the last time. I think you're going to see a lot of pins, a lot of majors and techs. Probably not too many decisions. Could be 7-7 and go to bonus. But there's definitely a chance for Audubon this year to beat them. They're kind of a funky team. They beat Gloucester, which was a great win, and then came back and lost to Gateway, which was Gateway's an up and coming team, but it was still a little surprising. So we'll see. Again, it's going to come down to who can manage their bonus points and who wrestles better. Paulsboro, as you mentioned, you look at that tradition. Even though a lot of these kids, Paul Marina told me the other night, didn't really grow up in that tradition. They weren't, their fathers didn't wrestle, their uncles didn't wrestle. Some of them haven't been in the Paulsboro midgets, from the time they were 5 years old. But they're learning about it, and I think that will maybe come into play, especially this match being at Paulsboro in that old gym where they don't lose very often, especially in the postseason, and should be a very interesting one with history on the line on Wednesday night.
We'll close things out with a look ahead to some potential semifinals and state finals matchups. We're projecting a little or projecting a lot in some instances here. As we're recording this, the non-public first round and quarters have yet to be wrestled. So while we have a good idea what's going to happen there, nothing's set in stone. We'll start in non-public A. I mean, Delbarton, the number 1 seed. I think we fully expect the Green Wave to reach the final. They're going to have the winner of Bergen Catholic and St. Joe's in the semifinals, which will be on Thursday. On the other side of the bracket, I think we're anticipating a Christian Brothers St. Peter's Prep semifinal. St. Peter's does have a quarterfinal match against Paramus Catholic, but Delbarton, the overwhelming favorite, don't want to write anything in pen just yet. We've seen what's happened in the non-public finals in recent years, but really the intrigue, I think, is on the opposite side of the bracket where we're all expecting CBA and St. Peter's to wrestle in the semifinals. That was a great match that came down to the last bout, and CBA pulled that one out in Jersey City recently. What are we thinking there, Ryan? I think that St. Peter's CBA match, assuming it happens, and we'll have that live on NJ.com, is going to be a great one, and that'll be for the right to try to challenge Delby for the throne.
Yeah, I mean, in the top half of the bracket, like you said, it's got to be Delbarton. They've been, far and above everyone else, and I feel like this is one of their better teams ever. I've heard a lot of coaches say that, one being Blair's head coach, Ross DeTomer. So that's high praise. I mean, and they've certainly wrestled like it. But bottom half, like you said, yeah, I mean, the CBA SPP rematch should happen. Paramus Catholic's a really good team, but I just don't think they don't have the firepower that St. Peter's has. I mean, St. Peter's is going to get a lot of kids to the podium. Paramus Catholic will get some, but not as many as St. Peter's will. I think that's the difference. I think you're going to get a little more bonus. Kids like Josh Paparo scoring a lot, the Joey Ruizes of the team and, stuff like that. I feel like St. Peter's has the firepower to go get bonus. But I think they could also flip this match against CBA. I would lean CBA again. I think if St. Peter's wins the toss, I know they definitely want to get that Verdi Ozerwitz matchup. And they kind of have to win that to make it happen. But, Verdi lost to him last year, but he beat him, I think it was twice when Ozerwitz was a freshman. So, I mean, look, it's a 50-50 match. And if you win that, you're in a very good spot. And if CBA wins the flip, I mean, from St. Peter's perspective, you would have to turn around the result between Anthony Barametti and Jimmy Jacob, that Jacob won by major. Barametti led in the first period. Or you have to go, get an upset win somewhere. Like maybe Gino Shanina can go up to 144 and stun Bobby Duffy or, something like that. But, it's ultimately going to come down to bonus. Like, can Paparo get 6 and not 5 this time? Or, can Ruiz get a major or a tech? Can Loudon Henry stretch out his match against Secudis into a major? Like, that's what's going to have to happen from the St. Peter's side. I don't think this is a steep mountain to climb. I think it's a mountain, but not a steep one. I do think, like I said, CBA is better. I think there's a reason they won that first match, but I think St. Peter's can win this match. Like I said, it's just going to have to come down to bonus, here and there, and obviously the flip.
Then in non-public B, we talked about the two undefeated public schools in Delaware Valley and Manville, and the other undefeated is Camden Catholic. They are the big favorite here, considering they have a lopsided win over Pope John already. If indeed it is Pope John to come out of a semifinal that we assume will be Pope John and Red Bank Catholic. But Camden Catholic, yeah, they're a buzzsaw, Bill, right now, and it doesn't look like anything's going to stop the Irish from racking up another state championship.
Now, this is one of the best teams I've seen come out of South Jersey in the over 30 years I've been doing this. I mean, you got the Paulsboro teams back in 99, 2000 that were number 1 overall in the state. Beyond, I mean, there's been some really good Delsea and Kingsway teams. But this team is awesome. I mean, and they're, top to bottom, very few holes. We've mentioned it before. They got Sammy Spalding, who's a state champ. They got Cage Jones, who's a state finalist. They have Michael Kraft and Jaden Simpson, who are top 4 in the state. They've added 2 freshmen down low, Stephen Magocius, who we have ranked at 106, and Chris Amato at 113. Madden Rosario's had a really good year at 215. Simpson being at 190. They've lengthened their lineup. Some other guys like Terry Turch, who's been around for a while and done some good things. Laz Joyce. I mean, just go on and on. I mean, there's a really almost a good kid at every weight. And like you said, they've been pretty much unbeatable this year. Now, the best team they wrestled was Paramus Catholic. I think that was maybe a 14-point win. Would have been great to see them against a CBA or a St. Peter's at least, and see how they would have matched up. We're not going to get that, unfortunately. They'll probably see Immaculata on Thursday night, who is an up-and-coming team. There are some other solid teams in this group. That match we could get Rhett Wasilewski from Immaculata against Michael Kraft, which would be a great individual matchup. And then, either Pope John or RBC on Sunday. RBC's obviously had a pretty good year, especially a second half once they finally got all their pieces in the lineup. But still, it would, they're probably the biggest favorite among anybody in this tournament. With all due respect to Del Val and Delbarton, I just don't see how there's anybody that can beat in non-public B that can beat Camden Catholic 7 times and win the bonus point battle. I just don't think it's happening.
And then in Group 2, we've been really impressed with Lower Cape May all season. As mentioned before, Rumson-Fair Haven, the 2-time defending Group 2 champ. So you're gonna have to beat the champ to take the crown from them. And the potential semifinal matchups can go a few different ways depending on what happens. It looks like the linchpin is, the High Point Passaic Valley sectional final. If High Point wins and Rumson wins, we're going to probably see a Rumson Lower Cape May semifinal. If not, then I think Passaic Valley goes down to Lower Cape May for a semifinal. We could have a Rumson Lower Cape May championship match. Specifically with Lower Cape May and Rumson, but we'll keep right here with you. This is something we've been looking at really since early in the season. Lower Cape May has had some really impressive wins, and if there's going to be a team to take it from Rumson, Lower Cape May, is the number one challenger. They're ranked higher in our NJ.com top 20, so you could make the argument that Lower Cape May is the favorite to win the title, but I think you'd have to give that nod, to Rumson just because they are the 2-time defending champs. But that's a really intriguing group to watch, from now all the way through Sunday.
Yeah, and Lower Cape May's wrestled a tough schedule, and there's been some common opponents. I mean, Rumson almost lost to Middle Township earlier this year. Lower Cape May has dominated them twice. There's been a few others that, when you go on comparative scores, Lower Cape May has, kind of beaten teams more handily. Now, obviously, as we've talked about today and all the time, it always comes down to matchups. But Lower Cape May is, this is their best team ever. That they have a state title contender in Chase Hansen. They've got some other standouts like Tristan Rosemeyer down low and David Douglas up top. Pretty solid, throughout, a couple holes in certain spots, but not too many. They can usually navigate around them. And you mentioned where you wrestled them. Unless you're down in Cape May County, it's usually a pretty far ride to get to Lower Cape May. So one of those teams is going to have to take a ride. And if it's Rumson, it's probably going to be a little tougher to go there on Friday than it would to face them at Rutgers on Sunday. Lower Cape May is another team, wrestles under a spotlight, tiny gym, should be a great atmosphere, assuming Lower Cape May gets past Collingswood, who's had a tremendous year of their own. But I mean, this is, I think Lower Cape May and Rumson is the matchup that we've been looking forward to. We'll see if we get it on Friday or if we'll get that on Sunday.
And then on to Group 4, where can North Hunterdon do it again? The Lions last year ended up winning the Group 4 title. They were the number 3 seed in the section. We knew that was going to be a tough matchup. Middletown North, they answered the call with a 32-point victory. Mount Olive and Phillipsburg is going to be a great sectional final. What do you guys think, Ryan and Jake? I mean, that looks like it's going to be a fun one when we get to Rutgers, depending on how the matchups shake out.
Yeah, I think, again, I think for me, those two teams, North Hunterdon and Phillipsburg, I mean, the fact that they met in the state final last year, is sort of crazy to think about. I mean, how often is it that you have two teams in the same conference, in the same division, in the same area that meet in the state final? But, because of how wrestling seeds its state tournament based on power points rather than, North 1 versus North 2, Central versus South, you can get that sometimes. And, I think in my mind, whoever comes out of either one of the North Group 4 sections is probably the favorite. Again, not having seen Colts Neck or, any of the, the Toms River schools or anything like that, Northern Burlington. But just knowing what I do about all these teams, they're well-tested, well-coached, they each have, individual standouts who can make some noise. And again, we talked a lot about Phillipsburg, Mount Olive. I think if Phillipsburg wins, they would have to travel. I think they'd be the 3 seed, if memory serves. which, that certainly complicates things because, that home mat environment and that home mat advantage for Phillipsburg, I think, is pretty real. But again, the Liners went on the road to Rumson and won by 1. They've gone on the road. They went on the road to Don Bosco and won. So, they've come accustomed to doing that. And then Mount Olive, too. I think Mount Olive, if they make it back there, the pressure's on them because they were well on their way to a Group 4 state title in 2024 until Ridge staged a comeback. Tanner Perez was leading, got pinned. That let Ridge go on its run, and Ridge eventually won by 2. So, I'm sure that's front of mind for a lot of people in Flanders. And, that's something that I'm sure they think about and is one that they feel like they want back. And especially, again, if they can beat North Hunterdon, who's the defending state champs, in a state final, or, if they can knock off any of these other teams. So, I think for me, at least on the public side, I think the Group 4 final probably provides, again, a similar level of intrigue to Group 2. So yeah, I think that'll be an interesting one.
Yeah, I think, Mount Olive's if Mount Olive gets paired up with Colts Neck, should they beat Phillipsburg, they have the head-to-head win over Colts Neck. Colts Neck came up to Mount Olive, and Mount Olive took care of business. But what I was going to say was, like, if you beat Phillipsburg, you have a reason to celebrate. But then you got to get through Dave Bell if you want to win a state title, and that's just as scary as a matchup with Phillipsburg. And North Hunterdon wrestled Phillipsburg very tough earlier this season. So, yeah, I mean, that's as big a mystery as, I would say Group 2. I think Del Val, Delsea, Southern, I think they kind of take care of business. Obviously, Camden Catholic, but like Mount Olive, Peaburg, North Hunterdon, that's as big a mystery as what's going to happen in Group 2. And we'll see about non-public A. Like I said, I do think Delbarton should take care of business there, but Group 4 is, one of those toss-up groups.
And then, as we mentioned, Delaware Valley in Group 1, Delsea in Group 3, and Southern Regional in Group 5, pretty substantial favorites to win those respective championships. We'll see if anyone can get in the way and pull an upset and prevent them from standing atop their respective groups. We're going to have a bunch of coverage, up and down the state. We'll have reporters out at multiple sites, and we'll be live streaming 3 sectional finals on Wednesday night. I'll be down in Kingsway for the South Jersey Group 5 final between Southern and Kingsway. We'll also have the Mount Olive Phillipsburg final and Ramapo and River Dell as well. So looking forward to those matches, and we'll be back next week to wrap it all up. The road to Jersey Mike's Arena in Rutgers University continues. We will also have all 8 of those championship matches streamed live on NJ.com. So for my guys here, Bill Evans, Ryan Patti, and Jake Aferiat, thanks again for tuning in to Weigh In Podcast, and we'll see you next time on NJ.com.